He arrived in the Philippines with a briefcase full of contracts and a heart hardened by decades of corporate warfare. Julian was a man who measured life in square footage and quarterly dividends, a man who believed that everything, and everyone, had a price tag that he had come to the sleepy coastal town of El Nido not to marvel at the limestone cliffs or the turquoise waters, but to pave over them. To him, the humble wooden huts of the locals were merely obstacles in the way of a five-star vision of steel and glass. He came to take, convinced that his wealth made him a king among peasants. But he didn't know that within 72 hours he would find himself shivering in the mud, realizing that his millions couldn't buy a single breath of the one thing he needed most, a reason to keep going. This is not a story about a real estate deal gone wrong. It is a story about the moment a man who thought he owned the world realized he was utterly lost within it. It is a chronicle of how the slowness he despised became the very rhythm that saved his soul, and how a people he viewed as poor showed him a richness he could never find on a balance sheet. If you believe that the greatest treasures in life aren't found in a bank account, but in the quiet kindness of a stranger's hand, then subscribe to this channel as we explore stories that change the heart. Julian stepped off the small propeller plane and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the humidity, a thick blanket that seemed to mock his three-piece Italian suit. To him, the heat was an inefficiency, a flaw in the climate that slowed down the gears of progress. As he sat in the back of a cramped, rattling van, he looked out the window not at the lush emerald canopy of the palms, but at the dusty tricycles and the groups of men sitting outside small sari-sari stores. He saw poverty where there was actually peace. He saw slowness where there was actually presence. He adjusted his silk tie, his mind already racing through the legal loopholes he would use to displace the fishing community that sat on the prime beachfront he desired. He was a man who had spent his life building walls of polished stone around his emotions, believing that vulnerability was a debt he could not afford to pay. To Julian, the world was a chessboard, and the people of this island were merely pawns to be moved, or discarded, to make room for his luxury empire. The driver, a man named Tati, a friend with skin the color of mahogany and a smile that seemed permanently etched into his face, tried to offer Julian a piece of dried mango. Julian didn't even look at him. He simply held up a hand in a cold gesture of dismissal, his eyes glued to a tablet screen filled with architectural renders of concrete towers. How can people live like this? Julian muttered to himself, watching a young boy wash a water buffalo in a muddy stream. He saw no value in the simplicity, only a lack of ambition. He didn't notice the way the boy waved at the van with a genuine, toothy grin, or how the neighbors shared a communal joke across their bamboo fences. Julian was insulated by his arrogance, convinced that his mission to civilize this coastline was a favor to the locals. He was a man who knew the cost of everything but the value of nothing. By the time the van reached the outskirts of the village, Julian's patience had worn paper-thin. He snapped at Tati, a friend, for the bumpy roads and checked his satellite phone every 30 seconds, cursing the lack of a 5-bar signal. He was a man possessed by the ghost of more, yet his internal world was a hollow cavern. Back in London, he had a penthouse, a fleet of cars, and a staff that feared his shadow, but he hadn't shared a meal with a friend in years. He arrived at his temporary villa, a luxury outpost in the middle of the wild, and looked down at the flickering lights of the village below. He didn't see the families sharing laughter over a single grilled fish. He saw a hurdle. He spent the evening barking orders into his phone, his voice echoing through the empty, high-ceilinged rooms. He felt superior in his isolation, unaware that the very slowness he despised was the only thing keeping the soul of the island alive. But the universe is a way of humbling those who think they are tall. That night, the sky didn't just turn dark, it turned bruised. A sudden, violent tropical depression moved in, the kind that turns a paradise of the Philippines into a roaring theater of wind and water. As the storm intensified, the unbreakable luxury of Julian's villa began to fail. The power cut out, plunging his world into a terrifying, absolute blackness. Then came the sound, a sickening crack of a massive gnarled tree splintering under the gale, crashing through the roof of his bedroom. In an instant, the man who owned half of a city was pinned under debris, cold rain lashing against his face, his satellite phone shattered and useless on the floor. He shouted for help, but his voice was swallowed by the howling wind. For the first time in 60 years, Julian realized that his money was just paper, and his status was just a myth. He lay there in the mud and the ruins, certain that he would be found only when the sun rose on his cold, lonely remains. The dawn did not bring a golden sun, but a gray, muted light that revealed the devastation of the night. Julian lay shivering, his legs trapped beneath a heavy mahogany beam in a mountain of shattered tiles. His expensive silk shirt was now a sodden rag, and the cold had seeped into his very bones, stripping away the last remnants of his corporate dignity. He had spent hours rehearsing his own eulogy in his mind, realizing with a bitter pang that no one in his life would truly mourn the man, only the estate he left behind. But then, through the rhythmic drumming of the receding rain, he heard it, the squelch of boots in the mud and the frantic calling of voices. It wasn't the rescue helicopters he had imagined his money would summon. It was a group of local fishermen, led by Tatia Friend, the very man Julian had treated like an invisible servant just 24 hours before. Without a moment's hesitation, the men threw themselves into the wreckage. There were no heavy machines, no specialized tools, only the raw, callous strength of hands that spent a days pulling nets from the sea. They worked with a focused intensity, a display of Bayanihan that Julian had only read about in cynical travel brochures. They didn't ask if he had insurance. They didn't ask if he would pay them for their labor. They saw a fallen brother, and that was enough. As they finally heaved the beam off his crushed legs, Julian let out a cry of agony that was quickly met by the steady, comforting hand of a friend on his shoulder. "Ios Lang, sir." "Safe NAKO," a friend whispered. "It's okay. You're safe now." Julian, the man who had never allowed a stranger to touch him, clung to the fisherman's mud-stained shirt as if it were the finest silk in the world. They didn't take him to a hospital. The roads were washed out and the bridges were gone. Instead, they carried him on a makeshift stretcher of bamboo and burlap to a friend's own humble home, a small hut that Julian had once planned to bulldoze. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and dried fish. Ephraim's wife, ailing Maria, didn't look at Julian's expensive watch or his ruined designer shoes. She looked at his pale, trembling lips. She spent the afternoon stoking a small fire, preparing a bowl of hot lugor, a simple rice porridge flavored with ginger and a few scraps of chicken. As she sat by his side, patiently blowing on each spoonful before feeding him, Julian felt a lump in his throat that had nothing to do with the food. This was Malasakit in its purest form, a deep, selfless care for the well-being of another, offered by those who had the least to give. Julian watched as the family shared a single plate of vegetables in the corner, ensuring he had the only portion of meat available. He realized that while he had been calculating the market value of their land, they were demonstrating a human value he couldn't even comprehend. He saw the children playing with pebbles on the floor, their laughter ringing out despite the leaking roof and the damp walls. He had come here to fix their lives with progress, yet he was the one who felt broken, and they were the ones fixing him. His walls of arrogance didn't just crack, they disintegrated. He looked at the bowl of porridge in his hands, a meal that cost less than $1, and realized it was the most expensive gift he had ever received, because it was given with a love that expected no Yutang and A-lube, no debt of gratitude in return. His worldview, built on the accumulation of things, shattered in the warmth of that small, candle-lit room. When the waters finally receded and the first helicopters of the official rescue teams hummed in the distance, Julian found he didn't want to leave. He stood on the porch of the small hut, leaning on a crutch fashioned from a sturdy branch of a guava tree. He looked out at the village, not as a site for a future resort, but as a sanctuary of the human spirit. The men were already out in the mud, helping one another upright their tilted homes, and the women were communalizing what little food remained in their pantries to ensure no child went hungry. This was the true meaning of Pakikasama, the art of living in harmony, of prioritizing the we over the me. Julian realized that in his pursuit of a global legacy, he had forgotten how to be a neighbor. He looked at the contracts in his briefcase, now waterlogged and illegible, and felt a profound sense of relief. He wasn't losing a business deal. He was gaining his humanity. He spent his final hours in the village sitting on the sand with Tatia Friend, watching the sunset bleed purple and orange across the horizon. There were no cameras, no lawyers, and no agendas. Julian spoke for the first time about his own loneliness, the empty rooms of his mansion, and the silence of a life built on transactions. Efren listened with a quiet respeto, nodding as he mended a net. "In our village, sir," Efren said softly, "we do not have much, but we have each other. A man with a full stomach, but no one to eat with is the poorest man of all." Those words pierced Julian more than the shards of his broken villa ever could. He realized that the slowness he had mocked was actually the patience of love, and the poverty he had pitied was actually a freedom from the cage of greed. The departure was not the cold, professional exit Julian had planned. As he boarded the boat that would take him back to the mainland, half the village gathered on the shore to wave him off. Ailing Maria pressed a small pouch of dried mangoes into his hand, a gift for the journey. Julian didn't offer the money. He knew now that to offer cash for such grace would be an insult. Instead, he bowed his head, a gesture of profound humility, and promised to retain, not as a developer, but as a friend. He looked back at the receding shoreline, his eyes misty. The man who had arrived in the Philippines to change the landscape had instead been changed by it. He was leaving behind his arrogance, his isolation, and his fear. He was carrying away an inheritance that couldn't be taxed or traded, the knowledge that the greatest strength is found in kindness. Back in the glass and steel canyons of the corporate world, Julian would never be the same. He would eventually build schools in that village, and he would protect their coastline from the very destruction he once envisioned. But he did so quietly, without the need for a plaque with his name on it. He had learned that the true measure of a man is not how many people serve him, but how many people he is willing to serve. The Philippines had stripped him of his armor and replaced it with a heart of flesh. Every time he felt the familiar pull of stress or the cold touch of greed, he would close his eyes and remember the taste of warm ginger porridge and the callous, steady hand of a fisherman who saved a billionaire's life simply because it was the right thing to do. Julian's journey reminds us that the most beautiful landscapes in the Philippines aren't just the white sands of El Nido or the hills of Batanes. It is a landscape of the Filipino heart. We often travel to find ourselves, but sometimes we have to lose our pride, our titles, and our comforts to see what truly matters. Julian went looking for a profit and found a purpose. He discovered that while the world teaches us to build fences, the spirit of Bayanihan teaches us to build bridges. In the end, the richest people aren't those who have the most, but those who need the least and give a heart anyway. Has there ever been a time when a stranger's kindness changed the way you see the world? Or perhaps a moment where you realize your greatest struggle was actually your greatest blessing? Share your stories of Malasakit in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story touched your soul, give us a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that humanity is still beautiful. Don't forget to subscribe to help us tell more stories that bridge the world through the power of kindness. Until next time, remember, the best way to find your way home is to sometimes get lost in the right place.